Hello everyone, so I'm just going to today go through and talk you through the PowerPoint slide that I've attached to your assignment, because what I'm really aiming to do is to just give you a better understanding about what some of these new expressive terminologies actually mean and how you can use them to successfully discuss art and design work. So the first slide that we're coming to today is where we are looking at media handling and or techniques, and it's really about understanding what do those words actually mean in art and design, because when you have an understanding about what they mean, then you're going to be able to discuss them much better. So we're going to come first of all to the media. And the media here is about looking at the artwork and deciding, well, what has the artist actually used to create this piece of artwork? And you can see here I've given a range of examples. It might be using the camera if it's a piece of photography, it might be clay for 3D work, and you can see at the top some of the tools you'll be used to seeing in class, such as paint and coloured pencils, oil pastels, chalk pastels, and printing and so on. So the media is about what is the actual substance that has been used, and depending on what the actual material is, this can give a completely different feel for the overall effect of the artwork. Now this applied with the techniques that the artist has used, and in a sense of techniques, what we mean by that is the working methods. How has the artist used those materials, that media, to create certain effects? And what does that make us feel or think about when we look at the artwork? And so here I've got you to start thinking about, how has the media been applied? Are there any obvious brushstrokes, or has it been smoothly blended? You can see here is a whole range of different approaches to techniques. For example, the top one, yes, the media that has been used for the forest has absolutely been a camera, it's a photograph. However, the technique that's being used here might be the viewpoint. So for example, the photographer has crouched down, they've got things at an unusual angle, and then they've thought very much about the lighting and how the lighting has created a kind of atmosphere to the piece. So the technique that's been used in this digital photography has been very well considered. We've also got on this page a range of other artworks that we could think about. At the very bottom with the pears, we have a technique called pointillism. And you can see here at the pears, it's basically a range of dots to create different layers of tone, but it gives quite a clear texture to the piece, quite a rough texture, quite grainy. Compared to, for example, the landscape to the right of it in the background, which is a very impasto approach. And impasto basically means it's not realistic. It's almost as if it's been painted on with obvious brushstrokes or with a knife. The objects sort of blend together, and they're not divided out quite tightly the way you would see in something which is quite hyper realistic or photorealistic in its piece. And so it's about looking at the artwork and making decisions. One, what has the artist used? Sometimes it'll say what the artist has used next to the artwork, to let you know what material has been used and what media they've used to create it. And two, what techniques have been used? Make a decision, look at it, ask yourself the question, how has the artist approached this piece? If you were creating it, what would you have to do to the media to get the effect that you can see in front of you in the finished artwork? So that is media and techniques. Okay. Next, we're going to move on to discussing the subject matter and the imagery, and also the use of scale. If I could come to the use of scale first of all, because that's quite an obvious one, and it's really about talking about the size of the piece and whether things have been made larger than life, whether they've been made particularly small for a particular reason, and whether it's to emphasise or exaggerate proportion, or whether it's actually made life size. And you can see in the example here, it's quite naturally a larger than life, We can see that with the scale of the background and the distance of the buildings, that this is a sculptural piece that has been made exaggerated in size, and it will have a particular effect on us as the viewers. And you can see I've made that quite clearly. No matter what the scale is, the fundamental question is always, well, what's the point of this? What's the effect of this? What does it do to us as the viewer? That's what we're always thinking about when we're discussing artwork. When we are considering the subject matter or the use of imagery, what they're asking is, what has been used to make up the piece? What objects are in the piece? What is the focus of the artwork? And you'll see a range of questions I've got down the side here. So what do you see in this piece? Where is it set? Is there a focal point? Is there a strong theme? Do we have a certain message or mood coming through? Does anything in place represent something deeper? How are they arranged? What are they sitting on? What kind of setting? Or sometimes it can be down to the title as well. For example, afternoon tea, if I was to say that as a title, you might have objects come to mind that you think you would expect to see in the piece. So most importantly, how does the artist achieve the above points? And again, it always comes back to what is the effect on us as the viewer. So if we look at some of the examples I've given here as different examples of subject matter, we can see in the first piece we've got a landscape and also a piece of still life with the boat. And what I mean by the focal point is if you're to turn away and look at the screen, where is your eye drawn to? Now, for me personally, it's drawn to the white part of the boat. That's where my eye is immediately drawn to as the focal point. And why is that? Well, it's drawn to it because it's central to the piece, because it's much brighter than all the other colours which have been used. And the artist will have made those decisions on purpose because he wants us to look at this part in the foreground of the artwork that they've created. We then move on to the next piece, and the subject matter here is still life. What I mean by still life is inanimate objects, so objects which do not move. Okay, so here we can see the jug, the pear and the grapes. And what's important to consider here as the focal point is that there's this obvious contrast between warm and cold colours with the green and the red, but also in terms of composition, the artist has used a kind of rule of triangles approach where the peak of the triangles are those grapes, and that is where my eye is drawn to when I turn away and look at that. You may have a different focal point, but as long as you can justify why you think you're drawn to those areas, then you're going to that's not going to affect your response in any way. And the final one at the side here that I've shown as an example, in this case the subject matter is portraiture. And here when I'm looking at the artwork, I'm immediately drawn to the eyes, and I think it's because they are very strong, bright blue, and typically in portraiture, when we're looking at portraiture work, we tend to be drawn to the eyes because all the emotion and the expression tends to be captured and held in those areas. So it's about really considering subject matter, why it's been used, how it's been used, and what effect, again, it's creating on us as the viewer. We're going to move on now to mood and atmosphere, and you'll notice that you are specifically asked about this in your activity. So it's really important to have an understanding about what is mood and atmosphere and how does an artist capture and create this in their artwork. So looking at it here, what I've said is the impression of, mood and atmosphere is the impression an artwork makes you feel or it gives you. And this can be changed through a range of ways, including the use of colour and tone, the lighting, the style, a theme that's maybe coming through, or, for example, personal taste. And I'll discuss across this whole page here of different ways in which we can create moods and atmospheres. Here, a few questions to consider would be, is there an obvious theme used in the piece? What do you think was inspirational behind it? Consider the visual elements and how they've been used and how they might relate to particular sources of inspiration, or does the title give you a clue to any of the influences? And how do all of these influences and elements contribute towards creating a feeling, a mood and atmosphere? So if we look at the images to the right hand side at mood and atmosphere, if I bring your attention first of all to the bottom kind of landscape image, the theme that really comes across to me here is an autumn feel. And why do we get that mood and that feeling to it? Well, to me, it's all down to the colour that's been used. We've got warm colours, we've got kind of autumnal tones of the reds and the oranges and the browns and the yellows, and we've got the leaves in the ground. And really, without knowing that the title was autumn, I think we can make justification that the atmosphere that's created in that particular piece is an autumnal one, and therefore autumn might be the season that's being portrayed in this piece, and we can back that up fully through the mood and atmosphere. When we look at the piece directly above, we get quite a rich and a dark atmosphere, and again that comes a lot down to the objects that have been used and the colours that have been used. The use of black, we tend to associate that with death and things that are dark and decay. That gives a quite haunting piece to it. That contrasted against the bright red of the lobster. Red, a colour we associate with passion and danger and anger, really gives quite a dark meaning to the piece. And again, the actual objects that are used on the table, the use of the ivory horn, the gold that you can see, the trinket, and the use of the lobster, we associate this with wealth and stature, and therefore that's the kind of justifications that we're looking to talk about when we're discussing the mood and atmosphere. Finally, when we come to the piece that's named The Birthday Party, that would be quite obvious in terms of the birthday hat that's been used, but it's not obvious at any other part of this piece. We can see that the use of scale and proportion has been quite exaggerated, with a very small heart contrasted with the very large face, but the proportions of the face remain small within that setting. We can also see that there's a very sad and sombre mood based on the expression of the portraiture, but also with the very muted colour palette that has been used in the background as well. The use of greens and yellows make the piece look quite sickly, as though something quite tragic has happened in this person's life. Where I would also say your personal taste comes into it. So at the bottom pieces here, I'm going to draw your attention to the portrait. And here you might discuss the mood and atmosphere here being quite energetic through the vibrancy and the use of colours. And similarly, you might describe the the mood and atmosphere of the still life to be quite childlike. And we'll discuss why that can be quite childlike when I move on to style just in a moment. But I hope that you can gather how to talk about mood and atmosphere, and you won't be afraid if you're giving an image and you are trying to discuss mood and atmosphere moving forward. So now we come to style. So this is the overall look of the piece, and in order to get the overall look of the piece, we need to consider their working methods, their use of colour and techniques, or any obvious themes that are in place. So you're looking at a piece of work and you're discussing its overall style. If I draw you first of all to the oranges against the kind of aqua background at the bottom, here this piece of still life is very minimalistic. There are only 3 shapes within it. They are equally spaced, and therefore I would be happy to say the style in this piece is very modern and simplistic and minimalistic. So how do we justify that? We would justify through the fact that there's not a lot going on, that it's quite contemporary in its arrangement, it's quite against the grain. When you look at more traditional still lifes that are quite overlapped, on the next slide, and also on the Matisse piece to the left hand side, you can see that this is very much a drawn in version of a still life artwork. You could also discuss in the Matisse piece, as I said earlier, it's a bit childlike. Well, how do we know that? How could we describe that as a style? Well, if you think back to your childhood, this piece reminds me very much of a colouring in book in terms of the black outlines. So I would be discussing the fact that the heavy use of black outlines reminds me of a colouring in book, something from childhood. The fact that they've stuck to the primary colours of the yellow and the blue throughout the majority of the piece. And also the fact that there isn't a lot of tone and dimension. The pieces remain very flat, and that the yellow vase, for example, has been painted yellow. that to me is a very childlike approach to describing the style of this particular artwork. We're now going to move on to the visual elements. Now, these are absolutely fundamental for all pieces of art and design, from S1 all the way up to S6 and beyond. It's important to really know what the visual elements are. You will have heard me speak about them before, or I'm sure you will have heard it with your previous class teachers last year. But it's important to really understand what they are so that you can confidently talk about their use in critically analysing artworks by artists or design works by designers. So I'm just going to very, very briefly go through what each of them actually are. I'm going to discuss them in relation to what they look like in the painting on the right hand side, so that when you come to analysing the activity that I've assigned you, you'll be much more confident to do that. So if we start with colour. Now, here it says, describe the colour palette being used. Are there warm, cold, contrasting, harmonising colours? What effect does this have? I'm not looking for you to go away and answer that in relation to this question, this artwork. These are questions I want you to be thinking about in your head when you're asked to talk about colour in an artist's work. So the colour palette that's being used. Harmonious colours. What are harmonious colours? Well, harmonious colours are colours that are very close together on the colour wheel. They are colours that look well together. They're the type of colours that if you were decorating your house, you would have those colours working together and decorating the interiors in a room. If you think about harmonising in music, that's voices that sound well together. So always think about colours in harmony are colours that work well together. And you can see in this piece here, there are quite obvious harmonising colours with the close use of purples and blues used together throughout the fabric and the integration of pink. So the colours very much work well together. It's nice to look at, it's pleasing on the eye. You might also think about, have warm colours been used, and what colours do we associate with being warm? Have cold colours been used, and what effect cold colours have on the piece, and whether contrasting colours have been used. And here we have a mix of all of those. The green that has been used here is quite a limey green, and you'll know that yellow is quite close to limey green, and yellow and purple are actually opposites on the colour wheel. Therefore, we can see clear contrast with the use of purple and the use of that limey yellow that's in place here for the green apples. And that creates a contrast in itself, causing the apples to advance towards us as they are quite warm, and causing the fabric in itself to recede from us, creating that focal point. So the impact in colour can be quite significant for artwork. The use of line. What are lines? Well, lines give the obvious outlines and shapes of objects. They are also flowing paths which can lead your eye to particular places in the artwork. Now here there are some obvious lines and some subtle lines. We can see the obvious lines that create the shapes of the background, of the sort of geometric shapes used, of the fabric, quite square shape, and also the circular shape of the plate. But we can also see some subtle lines used. For the pattern in the fabric, the lines seem to be flowing into the centre of the piece, drawing our eye to the focal point of the apples. There is also subtle lines in the crease of the fabrics which cause our eyes to follow round the fabric, again leading us back to that centre plate in the middle. And also the use of line for the knife, which diagonally crosses right into the piece and brings our eye to that particular apple in the centre of the artwork. So lines can be effectively used to create focal points in artwork, and it's important to consider where we can see these lines, where they're used obviously, but also where they're used in a much more subtle way. Tone. Are there obvious tones or highlights and shadows being used? Tone, I'm going to tie that up with form at the bottom. So tone can be used to make objects look 2D or 3D, and that again ties in with form. Here it's quite obvious that tone has been used effectively for the apples and also the creases in the fabric, which create quite a realistic effect. It creates a form which is very much three-dimensional. But if we look at the earlier work again, drawing you back to tone, there is no tone in the Matisse work, or very minimal tone, which creates a very flat and 2D form. So for example, the round shapes don't look very 3D, the vase doesn't look very 3D in the Matisse piece. Therefore, tone and form, we can tie that in together. We've also got pattern and texture now. Now pattern is very, very obvious here. There's a whole range of pattern being used. There's the floral pattern in the background. There's the pattern of the check fabric in the centre, and also the pattern that's being used as the ornate edging of the plate. And texture here, there's a range of contrasting textures. We've got the quite matte texture of the fabrics being used, and we've also got the glossy texture of the china plate in the centre of the piece. And it's really about having the confidence to talk about the contrasts and the effects of these varying patterns and textures that have been used in any artworks. Last one that I'm going to discuss will be shape. I kind of touched upon it with line, but here there are really quite obvious shapes through the geometric shapes and the organic shapes of the apple, the round shapes, and the more rigid shapes of the geometric squares used throughout. And it's about talking about the contrast of these and how, again, it always leads back to the effect. Where is our eye drawn to in this piece? What's the effect of the artist using these layers? For example, why has the artist decided to use the cloth in the middle and not bothered with just having the floral pattern and the plate? There'll be a reason behind it. Why do you think that artist has done that? Sorry, I'm beeping left, right and centre here, folks. I'm moving on to composition here. So composition is really about how the artist has arranged or decide to arrange their artwork. It's thinking about the foreground, the midground and the background of the piece. Where is the viewpoint? Where is the focal point? And how has the artist created that? Now, the artist may use a series of compositional arrangements. They may have used things such as rule of thirds, and I mentioned that earlier with the jug and the grapes being at the peak of, rule of triangles and the grapes being at the peak of the triangles. They may have used obvious symmetry and leading lines, the obvious symmetry being in place, for example, up here with the oranges, the leading lines, again with the use of the knife and the artwork above leading us to the particular focal point. There may be natural frames. You can see natural frames being more relevant in this piece to the left-hand side of the street view, where the buildings are basically creating a natural frame and forcing a focal point in the piece to the back building. And it's about how has the artist really created it, and what is the effect, where is the focal point, how have they drawn our eye to the focal point. So in terms of composition and arrangement, that's what I'm meaning. The last PowerPoint slide that I want to discuss, and then hopefully this will help you very much with undertaking the activity, is you being able to form a good opinion about an artist's work and why. Now, an opinion is very important because it's your own opinion. It's not something that I am forcing down your throat, so to speak. I want you to be able to have the confidence to talk about artwork and be able to justify your reasoning as to whether you think something is successful or unsuccessful. You will notice in your assessment today, your assignment, that I'm asking whether or not you like the artwork. And I'm not looking for a simple yes or no response. I don't mind if your answer is yes, I don't mind if your answer is no, but what I'm really looking for is for you to justify your reasoning as to why your answer is yes and as to why your answer is no. So I've created this wee flowchart to help you figure out how do I come about formalising that opinion. So this starting question is, do you like the artwork? Okay, your answer might be yes and your answer might be no. But in both boxes, if you follow the no, for example, I'm looking for you to justify what it is that you don't like about it. So following the red arrow down, you're going to think about, okay, what is it I don't like about this? Is it the use of any of the visual elements? Is it the use of subject matter? Is it the way in which the artist has applied the media? Or is it the mood and atmosphere that's been created? Or is there another reason, for example, composition? Okay? If your answer is yes, that you do like the artwork, you will notice that your questions are the same. What is it that you like about the artwork? Is it the visual elements, subject matter, media handling, mood and atmosphere, or another reason? And if you can't remember what each of these words mean, I suggest you go back to the earlier slides and familiarise yourself as to what subject matter means again, what media handling means, etc. And that hopefully will be a starting point as to what it is about the artwork you don't like. Then I would be looking for you to then discuss this area and consider how and why this makes you feel a particular way. Consider the effects this creates and how you would like to see it differently if relevant. For example, you might go up to, let's say this was your artwork you were discussing and you're formalising an opinion of it. I'm going to give a positive opinion and I'm going to give a negative opinion of that artwork so that you can understand the difference. So, the first response is going to be a positive one. Yes, I like the artwork which has been created. The reason I like the artwork is the artist's harmonious use of colours. The artist has used pink, purple, and blue, which are all very close together on the colour wheel. I think that this creates a very aesthetically pleasing artwork. Now, aesthetically pleasing means it looks good. It looks good on the eye. Okay, so that would be a positive opinion, and you'll see that if you were to write that out, that would be a sentence or two long, but it would be a justified opinion as to why you like something. Now I'm going to give you an example of a negative opinion. I don't like the artwork which has been created. The reason I do not like the artwork which has been created is the artist's overuse of pattern. The artist has used a floral pattern in the background and then also used a checked pattern in the midground and also used a ornate pattern on the foreground. I think that this overuse of pattern makes the artwork appear far too busy and cluttered. Therefore, I do not think this piece has been successful. And that is a justified negative opinion of the artwork. Now, I hope that me talking you through this slide, as opposed to me just getting you to simply read it and answer the questions, will help you out in completing your critical activity. But if you do have any questions or further questions, feel free to contact me on Teams and I will do my best to answer all concerns. Okay, thank you and bye.